Hello, and welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific Wars webinar series. This month, we're focusing on women's history. Our guest today is Ann Todd, author of OSS Operation Black Mail, One Woman's Covert War Against the Imperial Japanese Army. I'm Karen Stevenson. I serve as the museum's Director of Visitor Services. And now I am so honored to introduce our presenter, Ann Todd. Ann has been a contributing author and consultant for the National Geographic Society and the Central Intelligence Agency. She worked as a historian and curator for the National Museum of the Marine Corps and is currently the president of the Council on America's Military Past. Ann served in the U.S. Coast Guard and now lives in Dripping Springs, Texas, where she's the proud parent, proud human for dogs, Bear, and Angel. Ann.
Okay, thank you. The Office of Strategic Services is often referred to as the precursor to the CIA, and it was, but it also gave birth to Special Forces, the National Security Agency, and all forms of psychological warfare being practiced by this country today. There's also a quirky fly-by-night outfit that made things up as it went along. Detractors often referred to CIA personnel as oh so social, spies with ties, inmates running the asylum. My personal favorite is a PhD who could win a bar fight. When America entered the Second World War, this country had a lot of people who wanted to serve, but not everyone was cut out to serve in the military. OSS attracted quite a few characters who found a home there and were still able to serve. So I have a little list, a sampling. In addition to every ethnic group and nationality, we had cartoonists and scholars, movie stars, film producers, artists, journalists, priests, dog trainers, safecrackers, members of the Canine Corps, carrier pigeons, and one elephant was on the roll by the end of the war. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, December 7th, 1941, there was no agency of the United States government that was in charge of coordinating the gathering of intelligence. No part of the military was training for commando-style warfare, and no one wanted anything to do with psychological warfare, that most distasteful of activities. Thanks to one man, William J. Donovan, Medal of Honor winner, Wall Street lawyer, the groundwork had been laid for just such an organization. Now, Donovan was not without his detractors, not least of which was a sizable contingent of the United States government, including, but not limited to, the FBI, the State Department, and a large part of the command structure of the US military. He did have two powerful people in his camp. Franklin Delano Roosevelt loved all things cloak and dagger, and Winston Churchill wanted to set Europe ablaze with the same kind of propaganda the Nazis had been dishing out for years. The subject of my book, Elizabeth P. Macintosh, was born in 1915 and lived to be 100 years old. She'd been a reporter. She served in OSS. She worked for the Voice of America, the State Department, a long career with the CIA. She wrote 2 children's books and one fabulous history book, Sisterhood of Spies. She traveled all over the world to find women who had served and wrote about them. I knew Betty the last 5 years of her life. And during that time, she told me that the 18 months she spent in OSS were the very best of her life. And I wanted to know why, because I thought it would give me insight into this legendary organization. She was a daughter of 2 newspaper reporters. She grew up in Hawaii. She was what I would call popular loner. She was editor of the yearbook, captain of the tennis team. Her teachers remember her as very bright, but extremely mischievous. But every day she walked home alone and went to see her best friend, Daisy the elephant, at the zoo. After getting her journalism degree at the University of Washington, she went back to Hawaii, and her father put her to work on the sports desk at the Honolulu Advertiser. She loathed the sports desk and contrived to get herself thrown off it by deliberately misspelling the name of Hawaii's native son, Duke Kamanahoko, the famous Olympic swimmer. One good thing that came from the sports desk, she met her first husband, Alexander McDonald. Betty and Alex were drawn together by a mutual love of all things Japanese. And so after they were married in 1940, they went to live, while their little house was being built on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean by a young unknown architect named Philip Johnson. They went to live with a Professor Watanabe and his wife in a traditional Japanese home so they could immerse themselves in the language and the culture. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Betty was in the kitchen making breakfast. She saw the planes fly by. Alex got up and put on his uniform. He was a Lieutenant JG in the Naval Reserve, and she didn't see him for 2 weeks. Everyone's life changed that day. Betty went from being a local reporter to a war correspondent. She was picked up by Scripps Howard News Service as a stringer, and she started writing some amazing stories. The problem was the US Army had clamped a lid of censorship down on the entire archipelago, and they weren't letting anything out. And she tried everything. She interviewed nurses. She hitched a ride on a sampan to deliver medications to the lepers on Molokai. She hiked erupting volcano. She tried sending her articles home to her friends, and they got pieces of paper that looked like this. Then, to make things much, much worse, it turned out that Alex was one of the censors working for the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the mother of all marital squabbles ensued. Lucky for Alex, Scripps Howard offered to send Betty to Washington, D.C., where she was to cover Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House, which she did. She had total access to her, the First Lady. And she was supposed to write a column every week on rationing. So after a few months of writing about melting down bobby pins for the copper, she grew frustrated. And then, as if out of the mist, a person in uniform came up to her and said, "How would you like to work for the government? Something secret, possibly dangerous, and we'll send you to the Far East." Betty turned up at OSS headquarters as soon as they would let her in the gate. On the first day, when she was having this, her picture and fingerprints done for this ID card, she met fellow recruit Jane Foster, who would become a lifelong friend. Jane was an internationally known artist. She was famous for her caricatures and collages. But she was hired to OSS for her fluency in Malay, which was the lingua franca of what was then the Netherlands East Indies. Now it's Indonesia. This is a sketch of her personal servant. His name was Dog. She tried to call him other things, but he liked his name. Betty and Jane were recruited into a new branch of OSS called Morale Operations, where they would learn to confuse, deceive, and demoralize the enemy, which in this case would be the Japanese. As I mentioned, psychological warfare was not the favored weapon in the US arsenal, but the British wanted it to be part of the overall Allied strategy. One man volunteered to take it on. No one knew how to train Psy warriors. The British gave Donovan lots and lots of advice, which he ignored. He decided to hire creative types, people who could think outside the box, business people, anthropologists, people who had been to the area and were familiar with the culture and the language. So I have another little sample of the kind of people that were drawn to the East Asia contingent of morale operations. We had a Chinese artist, a Shanghai businessman, a private detective, the producer of the Lucky Strike hit parade, an Olympic broad jump champion, patent medicine salesman, lots of missionaries. My personal being the elderly Miss Lucy Starling, who demanded to be able to jump into northern Thailand to set up a forward operating base. She could field strip a machine gun in seconds, blindfolded. The main tool of morale operations is black propaganda. Black propaganda goes to point of origin. So a newspaper is made to look as though it were printed in Honshu province in Japan, when actually it was created as a fake in Delhi. A black radio broadcast was made to sound as though it's coming from Tokyo, when really it was being transmitted from a hand crank generator in Chittagong in the jungle. I always explain black propaganda by saying Tokyo Rose did not practice black propaganda because she really was in Tokyo. She didn't pretend to be somewhere else. So this is a poem in a faked magazine, and it's posing as a publication from Tokyo, and it's supposed to be an inducement to surrender set to verse. The Japanese love poetry. This is a proposal to create a matchbox, recreate an ordinary matchbox. The Japanese then and now love beauty in every aspect of everyday life, aesthetics. So even matchboxes would be beautiful. And for a project like this, you have to have exactly the right inks, the vegetable dyes, the kanji script. I wanted to know how difficult it was to do this, so I took a little workshop in woodblock printing. People spend their lives mastering this. Now, to have multiple colors like this, it takes multiple wood blocks done at just the right, interval. The matchsticks have to be whittled exactly as they were in Japan and dipped. And the kanji script here for the subversive message that was put inside, that kanji had to be correct. It couldn't be too official. It couldn't be farm boy kanji, had to be just right. And the brush and the paper had to be just right. The Japanese weren't stupid. They still aren't. And they could spot a fake. So projects like this piled up for several months. And then in July 1944, Betty and Jane got orders to deploy to the China-Burma, India Theater of Operations. So for the backstory, when the Japanese invaded early 1942, General Mutaguchi's 15th Army landed and unpacked their collapsible bicycles and rode up the peninsula and occupied Rangoon. Then General Tanaka took his forces all the way up here to Michino, to northern Burma, to take the airfield. Lieutenant General Sato took his forces through the mountains and jungles of Burma up here to capture India, where he would occupy and move across to hook up with the Germans. But a funny thing happened when he got up here to the Kohima railhead. The British Army and their Indian soldiers defeated them on the plain of Kohima and turned them back. Sato messaged Mutaguchi and said, "Our swords are broken, we're going home." So he turned his forces around and they start back down through Burma. Anyone who hasn't been to Burma, the topography goes like this. In the morning, you can be up above the timberline where it's freezing, and in the afternoon or midday even, on the floor of 100-degree jungle, 100-degree humidity. So now going up through Burma, Sato's forces were winning. They were on the offensive. Their supply lines were strong. Their morale was high. Going back, they were down to one rice ball a day. They were getting sick with that terrible cerebral malaria. They were starting to have delusions, dehydrated. They were basically going down what amounts to a goat path, just real narrow. And on either side would be the deep, dark jungle. So they're already delirious and they're going down this path, and keeping pace with them on both sides are tigers getting fatter and fatter as they picked off these soldiers, terrified soldiers, from the trail. Meanwhile, up here in northern Burma, Detachment 101 was training the hill people to fight the Japanese. These gentlemen are Kachin mountain men. The Kachin had a robust warrior culture, but they were fighting with spears and knives. And so the Det 101 guys equipped them with M1 Garands and grenades and taught them how to wage war against the Japanese to great effect. These are Naga headhunters. They had a fierce reputation for being headhunters. So the Det 101 boys had high hopes for these guys. But when they met them, they found them to be gentle, jolly folk who really didn't want to hurt anyone. So they gave up on them. And then one day, the Americans were taking their midday meal, and a group of Naga jogged up and dumped a gunny sack of Japanese heads on the lunch table. The Americans lost their lunch and thereafter left the Naga to their own tactics and strategies. So the point is, Betty's target, Jane's target, all of OSS Morale operations were the Japanese soldiers that were demoralized and sick. They were spooked, and they were ripe for the kind of work that these girls were going to do. So when OSS Morale operations got to Asia, it split, and Jane was with the group that went to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And this was Detachment 404. This would be Donovan on one of his many visits. This is Colonel John Coughlin, who was the CO. Jane is not here because she, en route, had gone missing when she went off into the jungle to sketch the natives. She eventually showed up. OSS people did this all the time. Here we have Julia McWilliams, who we all know now as the celebrity chef, Julia Child. People say, Julia Child, she was a spy. No, she wasn't. She was something much more important. She was a registrar. Intelligence from all of the theater came to her, and she had a card system that Donovan couldn't believe. So she got all the intelligence, she collated it, and then she sent it out to whoever needed it to make it actionable. She's striking a coquettish pose here because she was trying to woo Paul Child, lumberjack, artist, judo master. Paul made three-dimensional tabletop maps that people use throughout the theater for operations. Paul was in love with Jane. So there was teams. There was Team Julia and Team Jane. Betty was actually on Team Julia, and we know who won. This is Dylan Ripley. Dr. Ripley was for many years the head of the Smithsonian Institution, but here he's a brand new PhD in ornithology. He was a bird watcher. Dylan, like Jane, if he heard the sound of the triple-breasted thrush, he would wander off into the jungle and someone would have to go bring him back. And when he wasn't doing that, he was running secret intelligence operations down into northern Thailand. This dangerous looking crew is Betty at Detachment 303 in Delhi. Here's Betty. Here's Marge Severance, her colleague, a British officer that she convinced to help her. This is Bill Magistretti, a fellow linguist who went to school in Japan as a missionary. This is Angel Puss, one of the many dogs that she rescued. This grumpy guy is the dog wallah. The British made it clear to the Americans, you have to have your wallahs. You got your tea wallah, laundry wallah, and the lowest of the low was the dog wallah. That's probably why he looks like that. So the first project, once they were in theater, was called Operation Black Mail. So when Betty arrived, she didn't have any of her equipment. And as I mentioned before, if you're going to do morale operations, black propaganda, you got to have stuff. You got to have equipment, ink. You got to have two kind of presses, offset and the kind that leaves an indentation. She had one box of typewriter ribbon and no typewriter. So the British had everything she needed. She went to the British and she bartered with a carton of cigarettes, her cigarette ration. And a British major told her, here's a nasty old moldy mail bag that we caught, captured up at Michigan. You can dip your fist in here and whatever you can bring out in one hand, you can keep and use. She brought out a bundle of postcards that were tied up. And when she opened it up, she realized that it was done in kanji script with a pencil. This is a proposal that she did actually, and she did this all the time. She did the project, executed it, and then submitted a proposal. So you see, this is the kanji script. It's in pencil. It's in schoolboy, farm boy, Japanese, as they called it. Easy for people like Betty and Bill Magistretti to understand. And the best thing is, this is the censor's chop, which meant it had already cleared all the gatekeepers. And if they could get it back into the mail stream, it would go straight to Japan. So what a lot of these postcards, this particular batch, it was young soldiers writing home to their young wives and mothers. And so Betty and her crew erased these loving messages and replaced them like a typical young soldier writing to his wife. She replaced it with something like this. Dear Keiko, the situation here has become unbearable. The war is lost. Do not believe what the government is telling you. I myself have fallen in love with a Kachin maiden and have been welcomed into her village where I will remain when my unit moves on. Please go on without me, your loving husband, Yoki. This went off so well, Betty hired a little assassin to go out on the trail and kill a courier, plant the mailbag, and off it went to Japan. They were so happy with it that they started capturing more mailbags. And so, for example, coming the other way, a young wife writing to her husband, Betty and her crew would erase the loving message and explain how we're having to sleep with the local officials in order to get ration cards for the children. The British thought this was wicked and brilliant. This is just a fake bombing of Japan. They've somehow faked these pictures or got them from somewhere and slipped this into the news that was going to Japan, or was faked that it was in Japan, so people would think that there had been bombing runs and atrocities. This is a threat letter. So when the Japanese were going north and winning, the village headmen were collaborating with them. Why not? They pitched their lot in with the winning side. So now it was OSS's task to flip these guys back. And so Betty came up with the idea of this threat letter. And it basically says, dear village headman, this is the blood of your fellow village headman, your neighboring village. We found out he's helping the Japanese. Your blood will be next. So then they would prick their fingers, drip blood on these things, and throw them on the floor and walk on them for a few days, give them to the assassin who would take them out and make sure the headman got them. These boys are the Kimpi Tai. They are the Japanese thought police, and they were the counterparts to OSS MO. Only they trained for years and years, learning the language and the cultures of the target areas. And, Betty and Jane and whatnot, they trained for 3 months. This is the Burma Road, which the Japanese cut in 1942. It went from the Lido railhead in Burma all the way to Kunming, China. Also an exact replica of my driveway. So when the road was cut and Betty got her orders in January 1945, the spring actually, to deploy to Kunming, China, she caught a C-47 here in Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta and flew over the hump of 581-mile gauntlet through needle-sharp mountaintops. The casualty rate was off the charts, and she was terrified. She looked down through her windows and could see the aluminum trail of death. Julia Child was in the seat across from her, just calmly reading a book. Betty said she hated her for that. And here's a typical one that didn't make it. Loss of all hands. So when Betty, and this is the blood chit that was sewn to the back of her jacket. I'm sure you know what that is. Help this foreigner. Yeah. Kunming, China, is on a 7,000-foot plateau. It's an ancient city that Marco Polo went through. So this is when Betty got here, the Japanese were surging all around the base of this plateau, which meant she was behind enemy lines. It was also the base of the Flying Tigers with their leader, Claire Chennault. This is Colonel Richard Hepner, which was the CO of Detachment 202 and soon to be Betty's second husband. This is Sammy. Sammy was Colonel Hepner's dog who took a liking to Betty. And Sammy came over the Burma Road, and the GI that brought him shared his gin ration with him. And so for the rest of his long life, in the evenings when Betty had her gin martini, Sammy took his in a saucer. So when Betty was in Delhi, they literally made things up as they went along and executed projects and asked permission of forgiveness later. Now in China, she stepped into an ongoing operation where there were magazines and newspapers printed on a schedule. So it was like being back in the newspaper business. And so here she's working with one of her helpers. This is an example of a black poem, a proposal for a black poem that they would put in a magazine. And again, this kanji script had to be exact, and the woodblock had to be right. Then summer of 1945, Kunming flooded. There's a famous flood. And they're actually standing in the floodwaters. The person who took this picture, that would be William Smith. He was a famous artist. And after he took this picture, he picked Betty up and threw her in the floodwaters in retaliation for sewing his sergeant stripes on upside down. The British stopped the war every day for tea. OSS had parties. They would pool their liquor, find formal wear, print these invitations, and usually once a week, they would have a party and a dance. So the last week, not quite the last week of August, next to last week in August, Betty stopped off at the Radio Shack, the Black Radio Shack, on her way to the Morale Operations tent. And the scriptwriter was stomping around in a swivet. He couldn't come up with an idea for something to beam into the home islands of Japan that would really upset them. He was blocked. He couldn't think of anything. So Betty says, well, how about the first week of August? This was last week of July. First week of August, have your prognosticator predict a great catastrophe, something from the sky with fire. Nadler said, that's so lame. No. So she went off, got her coffee. He decided he couldn't come up with anything better, so he used it. She flew to Chongqing to see friends. When she came back on August 6th, she found out that her great catastrophe had happened and her CO was looking for her. The OSS was disbanded October 1st, 1945. President Truman sent Donovan a letter thanking him for his service and sent everyone home. This is Betty, years later, standing by Donovan's grave. Back behind her there in Arlington Cemetery, there are two of her husbands, Bill Magistretti and Claire Chenault, among others. Women's History Month. Oh, here she is at age 98, looking good. Women's History Month. She gave a presentation on Sisterhood of Spies, just like today.
Thank you so much. How delightful this has been. When we look to the past, we always look to relevancies for our own time, to common connections. And it seems like what they were doing there has connections in contemporary times too. Betty used all available resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think she would have used these days?
Well, I can tell you a little story about Facebook. I was talking to her one night and she says, what is this Facebook thing? I really wasn't the best person to ask because I don't do Facebook, but I told her the basics of it. I went to the kitchen to refill our wine glass. I came back and literally on the back of an envelope, she had sketched out her plan for using Facebook to weaponize Facebook in a campaign against Vladimir Putin. I'm like,
Oh.
I think you got it. I think you, yeah.
Understands the tools. One of the other things that has been so striking to me through this is how many women were involved and how little we know about them.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with some of those other stories that we may not know as well as Betty's?
Well, you know, this story, the reason she wrote this book is because out of 21,000 people in OSS, 14,500 were women. And a lot of books you'll read, the vast number of women were clerical. And that's true. But what I'm finding now, I'm trying to follow up on her work and research women who aren't in her book, but that have gone just, you know, unrecognized and fallen below the radar. And so it's amazing what I'm finding. All these clerical workers, a lot of them had linguistic skills, which is why Donovan hired them. And they're over there interrogating Germans, interrogating Japanese, running their own agent nets, doing all kinds of things that they, you know, their designation didn't indicate that they would be doing, but he used everybody and used all their talents. So it's amazing the ones I'm digging up and finding.
It's so intriguing. I have so many questions. As you ended the program, you presented slides of Betty before she passed.
Mm-hmm.
One of them, the OSS commemoration.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like she stayed involved with those projects, even as they morphed and the CIA became more structured.
Well, I never could get her to tell me much of what she did in the CIA.
Well,
in fact, by her own admission, she did end up becoming a case officer and ran her own agent net in Japan. And she was undercover. But, you know, she just, in my book, I talk about when the Twin Towers were hit that morning, she called CIA and said, you know, put me back to work. So she was always ready.
And she was involved with them for a while. Do I understand that when we were chatting earlier, you shared with me that she had had a very special birthday.
Oh, well, her 100th birthday, they brought her in and served her favorite chocolate cake up in the executive dining room. The director cut her steak for her. It was very special.
That's really nice. Are there any other questions that we've had come in? Can you, oh, there we go. How many women were part of OSS?
Out of 21,000 people in OSS, the best count is right around 14,500. A lot.
A lot. And the next question, what year and months were these Black postcards, threat letters, et cetera, being produced?
So she was deployed to Delhi in July 1945. Those projects were between then and when she was transferred to China in 1944, I'm sorry. So that summer and fall before she was transferred to China in 1945.
What was the casualty rate for active OSS members? Personnel, I suppose.
Well, there's the Book of Honor. We're still finding women that died that didn't get entered. So they're entered all the time. For the women, it wasn't high, but I don't know the exact rate, but yeah, they died. They did dangerous missions.
Excellent, excellent. There's one final comment. Where are we on time? Oh, we have plenty of time. Is there any information on how effective the campaigns were?
See, when you do Black propaganda, it's not for anyone who needs instant gratification because it's opaque on both ends. You don't know if what you send out there, if it ever made it to its audience or if it had an impact. And that's the same thing today. When I read the strategic bombing surveys, there was indications that there was an impact in Japan. So we know things got through. I'd like to answer my friend Nick Reynolds, if I could.
You should.
What did Betty do at the end of the war after OSS was disbanded? Yeah, well, she went to work for Voice of America and the State Department before she was talked into coming back to work for the CIA.
Oh, what are you working on now or next?
I'm chasing down these women that she wasn't able to get to.
Very nice. I have another question. We have talked a lot about, the title of Betty's book again, before we get to
this
that?
one?
Sister.
Yeah. Sisterhood of Spies. This is a very dog-eared copy, but Naval Institute Press is still printing brand new ones, and it's a gem of a book.
Oh, here's a question. Does your book say anything about the counterfeit money that the OSS produced for the teams in the field?
It doesn't, but I have handled some of it it was interesting, at the National Museum of the Marine Corps, they had some of that counterfeit money. It's interesting. Mainly Chinese dollars. They would send OSS, some of these guys were 18 years old, and they'd send them with suitcases full of thousands of Chinese dollars. They were all, counterfeit, but it was to pay off their sources and whatnot.
All right. Was the OSS a worldwide operation? Are there stories you know of from Europe?
Oh, sure. I mean, in that war, Europe got all of the attention, really, right up until, until after the Germans surrendered. Many operations in Europe, absolutely. I mean, we had women that were undercover. Virginia Hall is a famous one. We had women running agents in Scandinavia. There was a famous photographer who was sent into Finland, and because she had been there before taking pictures, and she knew the commanding general. They were all over the place.
And the next question was USMC active duty personnel pulled into the OSS.
Sure enough, one of my little side projects is I'm trying to track down all the Marines that served in OSS. They were what we call seconded. Donovan would just poach them. And, if they had something he wanted, he would just take them, which, the generals hated him for it. But yeah, I've been looking into the Marines and also the Coast Guard guys that were seconded.
Mm-hmm. The question that we just had up about the dogs, there we go. How about a future book on Sammy the Dog and other war dogs? We've talked a lot about dogs.
I'm all about it. Love the war dogs. I can't write it because animal stories make me sad. Even if they have a happy ending.
Mm-hmm. But the martini sipping hound is pretty great.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see. When you're trying to track people down, do you ever run into dead ends? And how do you move on from there?
All the time. I mean, a lot of these women, they just went home and lived quiet lives. Their neighbors, their family didn't know what they'd done. And so, you have to look at the OSS rosters and see where they're from and try to find out, could they have done something? It's painstaking. Yeah.
And how has the pandemic affected your research? Are you able to dive in?
No.
What do you want to?
In fact, this project I'm working on now, it's all Google. And it's all open sources. And so, I've got a file on each of them. And the minute the archives open up, I'm there.
Oh, and now some of the comments. We talked about the money. Oh, let's see. One I especially like is excellent presentation.
Thank you.
But he was like a female James Bond, but a real life hero.
She was. She really was. Now, when she was in China, Burma, India, it was so odd because, for example, she had to pack ball gowns and tennis balls as her operational tools because she spent a lot of time going out with the British and dancing. And, they all did. They gathered intelligence that way. But now when she was in the CIA, my understanding is there was some real James Bond action going on there.
It's very exciting. So did the OSS collaborate with the Monuments Men on the recovery of stolen art?
That's really interesting. Depending on who you read, it was either inspired by OSS or there was OSS in the team. I haven't spent a lot of time tracking it down. It's, OSS pops up everywhere. Indiana Jones was OSS.
Awesome. Anything else that we're adding? Okay. One point we'd like to make is the background that you see behind us was very deliberately chosen. Can you explain to us what it matters?
The morning of the Pearl Harbor attack, what they don't usually cover is there was a campaign called Kido Butai. The Japanese had an advanced force of submarines, and they were out there around Pearl Harbor. And they also took mini subs, and 2 of them were launched to be part of the advanced force on the harbor. One of them crabbed under the subnet, and he lost his gyro and kind of ping-ponged around the harbor, didn't do any harm at all. That driver died, I believe. Another one was driven by a Japanese sailor called Sakamaki. Sakamaki's sub got hung up on a reef, and he got out and was washed into the arms of a sergeant that was patrolling. Betty had a good friend who was sent out to climb in that sub, a Nisei, a Japanese American. The guys on the show were like, you got to send a Japanese American, and Nisei, none of us will fit in it, which wasn't true. But her friend went out and went in the sub, and she got to know Sakamaki. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
all of this. It's so inspiring. And from the comments, we can tell that so many people enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next webinar will air on April 14th at 1 o'clock. Rich Frank will be our speaker. Many of you know that Mr. Frank is a noted World War II historian and author, and he is in the midst of writing a World War II trilogy. Please look for registration information coming to you soon through your email and along with postings on our website. You can always find information at pacificwarmuseum.org under events. And I want to remind everybody about the chat. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Ann's book, you can please order one on the chat.
Oh, can I show them?
Yes.
Oh, Naval Institute did me a favor and put an author photo with my dog Rufus on the back.
And in addition to that, we will also post a recording of this webinar online. As soon as we've got it up, we'll let you know. Thank you all so much for tuning in today.
Thank you.